I was outside St Andrew's Cathedral, and instead of the usual Falun Gong people, there were a number of young people who, were playing tricks. No, there were a number of young people who were campaigning about, saving the world, creation, and so on. So I went over to have a chat with them, and what struck me most was the terror that they really thought the world was going to end in 12 years. Now, when I was their age, the only people who stood on street corners and yelled, "The world's about to end, the end is nigh," and had posters and everything else, were kind of crazy Christians. And now the end is nigh is a message that is routinely fed to our young people. I think that's part of the mental health crisis, by the way. What's even worse is that they're being told, you can save the world, which, to put it in a Jordan Peterson way, you can't even tidy your room. How are you going to save the world? But it's a burden that gets put on people. I've seen people crying. Well, what's the point of getting married and having kids? Because we're all going to die. It's all doomed. It's the end of the world. And the news media feeds that all the time. So, I was here when we had that season of extraordinary bushfires. Not totally extraordinary, because I've been reading a lot of Australian history. But it was quite something to be flying down from Brisbane and seeing the sky all red to the west and seeing the fear on people's faces. But it seems like, I spoke to a group of lawyers one time and I said, I came to Australia, it was paradise. Remember how, everyone European wants to come to Australia because it's paradise? And since I've come, you've had drought, you've had bushfires, you've had floods, probably heading for war with China, plague. What's next? A plague of rats. And this lawyer put his hand up. And I said, oh, please don't tell me. And he said, David, where do you live? I said, I live in Artarmon. He said, I work for Sydney City Council. We've just declared a plague of rats in Artarmon. So I thought, oh, man, if there's anything that could, basically, I think we're growing up in this world that is kind of hopeless. Now, there is a kind of Christian version of things which basically goes, we're all doomed, we're all going to die, and the world's a mess, and just let's get to heaven and get this sorted as quickly as possible. I think that this passage is the greatest answer that you will ever get to what I would call the creation crisis. So what I want to do is play, if we go on to the next thing, I want to play a video. Some of you will know this. Let's see if, and that's the juxtaposition, isn't it? We live in this beautiful world. So here we are. This is a fabulous campsite. I'm really, really impressed. But if we took a circuit all around, there'll be houses where there's somebody dying, where there's a child being abused, where there's domestic violence, where there's deep, deep, deep depression. We live in this wonderful world, but it's a broken world. And again, part of the problem in our culture is, again, we're telling our young people this, you have a right to be happy. You have a right to be healthy. And if they're not, it's someone's fault. Probably not yours, maybe somebody else's. But the Bible gives a much more realistic view. And these verses, it's the suffering and the glory that's the big thing about this. That's the thing that gets me. The suffering and the glory go together. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. I spent some time in hospital, in a coma. I wasn't supposed to live, and it was not a pleasant experience. And I wouldn't want to go through it again. But when I think of something like that, or I see the suffering that people live in, Paul's saying this suffering is not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed. It isn't just pie in the sky when you die. So, let's just think about this just a little bit. Now, there is a great deal of suffering. You'd be incredibly foolish to deny that. I think one of the big mistakes we've made is to try and hide children from suffering. I think the first funeral I went to was when I was 19 years old. I think the third one I went to is I was a minister taking it. I think it was a mistake of my parents to shield me from that. Life and death, they are part of life. I think if you bring up children in a cocoon, and even if that's a Christian cocoon, I think when they come out of it, they're not going to be able to cope. And I think that's one of the issues that we have in terms of resilience. So, in this passage, there's a contrast between the suffering in the world and the glory of the world and the glory of the eternal God and the glory that is to come. Suffering and glory are not set up as equal opposites. They are set up as contrasts. So, for example, 2 Corinthians 4:16, therefore we do not lose heart, though outwardly we're wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is unseen, not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. What is unseen is eternal. And what Paul does, he uses two words that carry the idea of weights. You can gather from my physique that I don't lift weights, but for those of you who do, one of them is an incredibly light weight, and one of them is a heavy weight. In fact, he uses the word heavy. And one or two of you look as though you may have been around in the hippie era, and you've been to Katoomba, and you can go, hey man, that's heavy. Oh, heavy man, awesome man. That's and that's actually what Paul is doing. He's saying this is heavy. This really is quite extraordinary. So I want to look at what that glory is. Now, what does he mean by the suffering and glory of the creation? Let's look at verses 20, go on to verses 20 to 22. He talks about the creation waiting. What's the creation waiting for, by the way? It's waiting for the children of God to be revealed. The best thing you can do for the planet is to bring people to Christ. Because the whole creation is groaning, waiting for God's children to be revealed. That's what it says. And I think it's quite an astounding thought. It's the depiction here is someone standing on the tip of their toe, watching to see what's coming. And the creation is watching to see what's coming. The creation, it's such, Australia is such a beautiful place. I tease about Scotland, but Australia, pretty well second, maybe. But it is a very, very beautiful place. But it's extraordinary. I went out to, my daughter lives in the Blue Mountains. So I went out to see her. There's the creation joining in. And the first time I went out, everything in West Sydney was brown. And I thought, man, this place is a desert. And then someone on the ABC said, it's not going to rain in Sydney for 4 years. And I thought, oh yeah, watch out, here comes the deluge. And next week, it hasn't stopped raining ever since. And the next time I went out, and it was only like 2 weeks later, everything was green. It was utterly astonishing. You go out into the creation, you see the most glorious things, and sometimes then you see the most ugly things. And there is a groaning. The creation, it says, was subjected to frustration. That's referring to the judgment of God following Adam's disobedience. The ground cursed because of him, the thistles and weeds. Work would be sweat and toil, and eventually death would claim them, and they would return to dust. The word frustration is the same word that's used in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Ecclesiastes, by the way, is the best book to preach the gospel from to postmoderns. I just think it's brilliant. In fact, I mentioned the girl who was a drug addict. She asked me to give her a book in the Bible to read, and I had a copy of Ecclesiastes separate, and I gave it to her. And she came back the next week, and, again, man, that was awesome. That was awesome. That was like Kurt Cobain on speed. So if I ever write a commentary on Ecclesiastes, I'm just going to call it Kurt Cobain on speed. Kurt Cobain of Nirvana. And what it was just, she said, all that stuff about you party and what's the point, and you drink and what's the point, and you're all going to die, and the animals die, and you die. She said, how come that stuff's in the Bible? I said, did you miss something? She said, no. I said, well, what about the phrase, under the sun? I think it's 14 times it comes. She says, yeah, what's that about? I said, well, in your world, if it's only a material world, it's right. In fact, your feelings of suicide, I don't want to encourage you, but actually are realistic. The world's pretty much a mess. And your life has been a mess. And you've, experienced abuse and lots of other things. But under the sun is not all that there is. The burden that's placed, when I hear politicians say, we can vary the climate by doing this, this, and this, I'm thinking, you have no idea how narcissistic and stupid that is. The story of, and I'm not saying anything about climate change, which I happen to think is real, and I happen to think there are things that we can do. But the idea that we can control the planet is an absurd thing. It's the king who went down to the water, and tried to stop the waves. Well, people think that was him being a narcissist. It wasn't. It was him telling his subject there were things he couldn't do. And I do think that's really important. I live in North Sydney, so, we are absolutely full of people who are full of themselves at one level. And I spoke to one of the political candidates and said, so if you go to Canberra, you said you're going to clean it up and you're also going to save the world. And she said, yes. How can I vote for you? Well, I can't vote for you anyway because I don't have a vote, but I didn't tell her that. I was just, how could I vote for you? If you seriously think you're going to save the world. Now, again, that's not a reason for never doing anything, but it is a reason for getting a realistic aspects of things. And death is the ultimate futility and emptiness, isn't it? What's the point of Mozart dying at 35 years old? He could have achieved so much more. I was in a church with a guy called Robert Murray McShane, who's kind of like a Protestant saint, and people come in busloads to visit his shrine, even though we're Protestants and we don't have saints, but we do. Anyway, they come and... but he died at 29. Lord, what are you doing? It could have been so much more. Well, the secular vision of the future, there isn't one. The universe is either going to implode or explode. And everything that you or I do is ultimately completely pointless. Everything is meaningless. 100 years ago, the mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell used the second law of thermodynamics to attack theism. The second law states that the universe is dying. It's descending inexorably into chaos as its reserves of useful energy are squandered. There's no such thing, by the way, as renewable energy. There's energy that you can take and you get more from the sun, but ultimately the whole universe is going to lose its energy according to that. And Russell, now this is the atheist hope, by the way, reflecting on the vast death of the solar system, said this, that when the sun burns out in several billion years' time, brief and powerless is man's life. On him and all his race, the slow, sure doom falls, pitiless and dark, blind to good and evil, reckless of destruction. Omnipotent matter rolls on its relentless way. So you're all doomed, you're all stuffed, and nothing you ever do ever matters. Well, in that case, you might as well eat, drink, and be merry tomorrow we die. And you might as well shoot up and get some pleasure out of that. We must build, said Russell, our lives on a foundation of unyielding despair. That's where your atheism leads you. We are, he said, a blob of carbon floating from one meaningless existence to another. And, the answer that our society gives, you make your own meaning. I'm sorry, that is complete rubbish. And our society is going crazy making your own meaning. You can be whoever you want to be. I actually said to somebody once, if I said that I was a 5-foot Chinese girl who was a genius and a multi-billionaire, would you accept that? Well, if that's how you choose to identify yourself. I said, well, I can identify you as crazy. That's not. You can't do that. We do say it's delusional. I mentioned I was in hospital. When I was in hospital, they gave me a lot of drugs because I was in a lot of pain. So I had a lot of delusions, which my family still laugh about. Some of them were really quite funny. They were all grandiose, which maybe says about my character. I thought Colonel Gaddafi was after me. I thought that, I was dealing drugs to the King of Sweden. I don't know. I even actually wrote on a piece of paper. Can you believe this? I'm so ashamed of this. I wrote on a piece of paper. I've got the piece of paper saying, I want to see Justin Bieber. I've never been a Bieber, whatever it is they call themselves. But it's just so delusional, thinking things, and we become, I think, we just become quite delusional in our grandiosity. And we turn back to the Word of God, and here's the creation. It's frustrated, but it's going to be liberated. So actually, let me show you some photos. Can we go on to the next couple? I don't know if you can see that. That is my home back in the Highlands of Scotland, and this is the reason I couldn't be an atheist. I would sit and look out, and I would say, okay, I'm sorry, but there's a painting, there's got to be a painter. There's creation, there's got to be a creator. It doesn't make any sense to me. I tried really hard to be an atheist, but just intellectually, it didn't work. Emotionally, it worked brilliantly, but intellectually, it didn't work. Let's go on to the next one. That's, again, that's in Scotland, the Sidlaws. Right beside my city, we could go out, and there was just so many beautiful places to walk, and I would go up to this loch and just walk around it, and it was, I think as Christians, by the way, we should do this a lot more. We should learn to meditate on the creation, because it does speak to us of God. Let's go on to the next one. Even cities. I think Sydney is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. I hesitate to say this. I do think it is the most beautiful city in the world, at least that I've been to. But I don't say this in Melbourne, but in Newcastle you can handle it. You can cope. You're mature. But I actually love being able to look and see cities. And I used to work in an office and get the view from there along this river called the River Tay. It was wonderful. So we live in a wonderful world. Let's go on to the next one. But it's a world that's broken. It's a world that floods. So you've had I was in the Hunter Valley. I thought it was absolutely fabulous. But one of the vineyards I was at, it was swept away. Let's go on to the next one. There's the earthquake in Haiti. I've never been in an earthquake, but it must be just utterly astounding. And there are going to be many, many more things like that. We live in a world which is broken. Let's go on to the next one. And then we live in a world which is broken because of humanity. This may be hard to believe, but I actually stood on the Empire State Building and looked out over the Twin Towers. And what struck me about was the grandiosity of it all, and thinking about Isaiah, that the Lord can demolish these in any time. And I'm not saying God brought down the Twin Towers. It wasn't. It was human beings. But all that we build that we think is so brilliant is fragile. We are fragile. Believe you me, when you've collapsed in a pool of blood as a perfectly fit, healthy young man or middle-aged man, and you can't breathe, you know that your life is but a breath. Let's go on to the next one. So that's where we come in the sense of we groan and suffer. So there's a promise of the creation being liberated. But Christians also groan and suffer. I don't understand Christians who think that because you're a Christian you won't suffer. I'd want to suggest this. I think it's likely you could suffer more. Why? Well, for a start, you can't ignore the suffering in the world. You can't shut yourself away. You can't shut yourself away from people and follow Jesus Christ. And then you're going to suffer because people will make you suffer. And because one of the ways not to get hurt is not to love anybody. This is like a therapy session for me. When I was like 14 years old, my first girlfriend dumped me. And she promised me she was going to marry me and all that kind of stuff. And she dumped me because God was calling her to be single. The lies that Christian girls tell, I'll tell you. Because within a month she was going out with someone else. So God's call didn't last too long, or she was being very disobedient. But I went through the whole teenage angst thing. I thought, I will never trust a woman again, which is very good advice. No, I'll never let my heart. No, now you can do that. That's a kind of teenage silly thing. But I know plenty of adults who, you got burned. You got burned in church, so you'll never trust a church again. You got burned at work. You got burned with some of your family. And so what you do is you shut yourself off emotionally from everybody, but you become an emotional cripple. It's safe, but it's like being locked in your room and never getting out to enjoy anything. The fact is, if you are going to live this life, you are going to suffer. There was one way I could guarantee that my daughters never ever got knocked over by a bus, or never ever took drugs, or never ever got attacked in the street. That would be to lock them in their room. Never let them out. But what kind of life is that? My mother, at 12 years old, used to say to me, "On you go, son, go play on the cliffs." They were 200 feet high. I'm now beginning to think that she wasn't just too keen on me, but it was what a glorious freedom to have. I mean, can you imagine this happening now? At one point, my dad went away and the farmer told him to buy some cattle and said, when you get your son a pony. So he came back with a pony for me. I was a 9-year-old, I think, 10-year-old, with a pony. And, I learned to ride it. And then my dad said, take the air gun and here's some, your mom will make you some sandwiches and stuff. And away you go for the day, go shooting rats on a pony by myself as a 9-year-old with a gun. That's just, you'd say, well, it's insane. Report him to the social and everything now. Now, I'm not saying you need to do that, but I'm saying bringing up children in an atmosphere of fear is a dreadful thing. And Christians having that atmosphere of fear is a dreadful thing. So coming back to the creation, yes, we do all groan and we do all suffer as the creation does. But maybe let's go on to the next one, actually. We wait patiently. Now, what are we waiting for? We're waiting for the redemption of the creation, but we're also waiting for the redemption of our bodies, which is what he brings back in again. And we're also waiting that there would be just a whole renewal of humanity and beyond. And I think when we pray, you see, your kingdom come, your will be done. This world is an absolutely amazing place. But at its best, it's just a foretaste. It really is just a foretaste. I'll tell you this, you can go, and I hope this afternoon, for example, you wander around and you'll be amazed at the glory of God's creation. But if in your services on Sunday, you get just a tiny glimpse of the glory of Jesus and what he has done, you will see way more than you will see in the creation. See, I think an awful lot of what is missing in our worship is that sense of glory. We manufacture things, we package things, we try and do things, we yearn, we long perhaps, which is good that we yearn and we long, and it's good that we try and do things well. But the old brethren used to have a sign up in their pulpits. I thought it was a great sign. It would say, "Sir, we would see Jesus." I'll tell you this, if people come into your church and see Jesus, everything else fades. It's quite an extraordinary and wonderful thing to happen. So I look at this passage and I see this wonderful hope for creation. I see the creation groaning, and I see that we groan and we're joining in with it. And I hate the suffering. The Christian view of suffering is not a kind of Buddhist one, well, just get over it and you can learn to cope with it. It's not stoical. The pain is awful. And you know this, if you pray for God to give you his heart and his eyes for Newcastle, don't think you're going to suddenly be filled with this lovely warm glow. You're going to see some of what God sees, and it will break your heart. And sometimes you go, enough, I can't take any more. I can't take any more. But I honestly believe that there's a sense in which I wanted to go to those kids, finishing where we come out, I wanted to go to those kids outside the cathedral and say, do you know this? I admire you and you're right. There's a lot of trouble coming to the world. In fact, it's a lot worse than you think, because there's a life coming afterwards as well. But I also want to say to them, you're so wrong about the hope for the world. You can't take that on yourself. You can't put it on the politicians. But there's somebody who does care about his creation. Not just individuals within it, but the whole creation. There's a promise that it's going to be renewed. There's somebody who came and died for the world. Someone who came and died so that you ultimately don't have to die. And I'm not coming to you and saying, if you become a Christian, you never get sick. I'm not coming to you and saying, if you become a Christian, you'll never go through depression or you'll never have mental health issues. That's a lie of the devil. But I am saying this to you, that there is this promise that, in the words of the great Tolkien, are all things bad going to come untrue? And I think that's the case. I think the judgment day is a day of great hope. as we see God untangling and sorting everything out. So I want to return to my friend with the drug addiction problem as we talked about various issues. And she did become a believer. And I said to her, do you know, your life is an absolute mess. And I don't think God, he could do this, I don't think God is going to put a big explosion and everything's fixed and sorted. I said he can, and that has happened, but it's unusual. I think what's going to happen is throughout the remainder of your life, he's going to untangle bits, bit by bit, so you don't get too hurt. And that's going to continue until the day you die, and then when you go to heaven, you will be absolutely perfect. And everything is sorted. And I think, for me, that's a tremendous message of hope in the world in which we live. We live in a broken world. We care for it. We're stewards of the creation. We know ultimately that God is going to renew it, which is fabulous. We know we're going to be part of it. I'll leave you with this. Speaking in the United States once, and I mentioned the verse in Revelation which says God is going to judge those who destroy the earth. And this man came up to me afterwards and said, "Are you a tree-hugging communist?" And I said, yeah, I'll take the communist part. I haven't really done much tree-hugging recently. And he looked at me and he said, "Man, you're so wrong. It's all going to burn anyway." I said, "Yeah, you're right. It is all going to burn. So I'll tell you what. Where do you live?" "Pardon?" "So where do you live?" I said, "I'm just going to come around to your house and set it on fire because it's all going to burn anyway." Of course you don't think like that. We care for what you do. If you think, oh, the whole world's going to be destroyed, so I'll empty my oil out into the water out there. I don't care. I'm not going to be here again. I've got a broken bottle. I'll just throw it on the ground. Doesn't matter if some kid comes and stands on it. You know, we're all going to die anyway. Absurd attitude. Selfish and just incredible. But the Christian goes, because God's going to renew the world, we can care for it. And because all human beings are made in God's image, we can care for them. And because he heals the broken, we can be there for the broken. And for me, it's a very, very liberating thing to have. I've got nothing. I've got nothing to give you except Jesus Christ. But that's enough, because along with him comes everything else.
The light of life was crushed for our rebellion.